In 1983, Roger Corman watched the rough cut of Deathstalker, turned to his crew and said, "It needs more nudity." So they literally went back, shot even more topless scenes, and cut them into the finished movie. That same decade, two bodybuilder twins hijacked an Italian horror director's serious fantasy epic and turned it into a comedy without him even realizing what was happening. A respected exploitation filmmaker delivered his final cut to Roger Corman, only to have it butchered so badly he disowned the movie completely. These 80s fantasy films had wooden swords, $50 budgets, and more chaos behind the scenes than anything that made it to theaters. Let me show you the absolute insanity. After Conan the Barbarian made $100 million in 1982, every low-budget producer on the planet thought they could cash in. They shot these things in Argentina for basically no money, cast Playboy playmates for sex appeal, reused sets from other movies, and somehow convinced legitimate actors to star in them. But the real stories aren't what ended up on screen, it's what happened behind the scenes. Directors rewriting entire scripts overnight, actors improvising completely different movies, and Roger Corman demanding more nudity at every possible opportunity. Let's start with the most chaotic production of them all. The Barbarian stars two bodybuilder twins, Peter and David Paul, as barbarian brothers trying to save a princess. The director is Ruggero Deodato, the guy who made Cannibal Holocaust. So you'd think this would be brutal and deadly serious, right? Wrong. The twins read the script and thought it was absolute garbage. David Paul said it was terrible, full of dumb dialogue that didn't work at all, so they made a decision. The only way to make this thing watchable was to turn it into a comedy, and they just did it. Started improvising funny lines, playing their characters like lovable idiots instead of serious warriors, cracking jokes between takes. They basically rewrote the entire tone of the movie while they were shooting. Here's the best part. The Italian crew had no idea what was happening. Deodato thought he was making a real fantasy epic, a serious sword-and-sorcery film. Meanwhile, the twins are goofing around and changing the whole movie right under his nose. David Paul said years later they should have gotten story credit for how much they actually contributed. They essentially hijacked the production. It bombed in America because Canon Films was collapsing at the time, but it was huge overseas, played for months in some countries, and eventually became this cult thing. People loved how goofy it was, and the twins were actually proud of that. They'd taken a bad, serious movie and turned it into a fun, dumb one on purpose. But the twins weren't the only ones rewriting movies on the fly. A year earlier, Roger Corman was already perfecting his own formula for cheap fantasy chaos. There's technically a plot in Deathstalker about a warrior collecting 3 magic items to beat a sorcerer. But Roger Corman himself admitted his entire approach was to give audiences a ready supply of bare-breasted women and bloody sword fights. That's a direct quote, and he delivered exactly that. He made it in Argentina for basically no money. Reused sets from other movies he'd already shot down there, cast Playboy playmates for the sex appeal. One of them was Lana Clarkson. She was 6 feet tall and did her own stunts. There's this scene where she fights a tentacle monster in a real swamp, and apparently it was absolutely miserable to shoot. But here's where it gets good. They finished the rough cut and showed it to Corman. He watched the whole thing and his note was, "It needs more nudity." So they went back to Argentina, shot even more topless scenes, and edited them into the movie. Just spliced them in wherever they could fit. Deathstalker became a cable TV classic in the mid-80s. They made 3 sequels. Even compared to other cheap fantasy movies from that era, it had a reputation for being sleazy. But that was literally the entire point. Corman knew exactly what he was selling. Wynorski had seen what Corman did with the first one, and he had his own ideas. 4 years later, Jim Wynorski shows up in Argentina to direct Deathstalker 2. First thing he does is read the script, and he immediately realizes it's awful. Just completely terrible. So Wynorski throws it out. He decides he's going to rewrite the entire movie from scratch. Every single night, Wynorski and the lead actor John Turleski would sit in their hotel room and write the next day's scenes. They weren't trying to make a serious fantasy film anymore. They were pulling gags from Abbott and Costello, jokes from old Warner Brothers cartoons, whatever they thought was funny. Wynorski said they basically did their version of It Happened One Night. That's the Frank Capra romantic comedy from the 30s that won an Oscar, except instead of a romantic comedy, it's got swords and sorcerers and Amazon warriors. The budget was so cheap that all the swords in the movie are painted wood. There's this magical crystal ball that's supposed to be important to the plot. It's actually a glass doorknob, just a regular doorknob they found and used as a prop. The whole thing became this self-aware comedy. The plot is about the rogue Deathstalker teaming up with a seer to fight an evil sorcerer and his clone army, but none of it really matters because everyone's just having fun with it. It flopped at the box office but became a cult favorite with B-movie fans who understood what it was actually trying to do. Now, if you think a doorknob as a prop is ridiculous, wait until you hear what happened when Paul Verhoeven and Rutger Hauer tried to make a serious medieval epic. Paul Verhoeven and Rutger Hauer had made 5 films together in the Netherlands. They had this whole creative partnership, multiple successful films, then they made Flesh and Blood and didn't work together again for 20 years. Verhoeven wanted to make a brutal, unflinching movie about medieval mercenaries, show the Middle Ages as disgusting reality, mud, disease, casual violence. Rutger Hauer had just come off playing a romantic hero in Lady Hawk. He wanted his character Martin to be more conventionally heroic, more likable. Verhoeven wanted him to be a morally ambiguous anti-hero who does terrible things. They fought constantly on set. Verhoeven said later that by the end of production, they absolutely hated each other, couldn't stand to be in the same room anymore. The movie itself is exactly what you'd expect from Verhoeven. A band of mercenaries led by Martin gets double-crossed by their lord, so they kidnap a noble woman named Agnes, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, and hole up in a plague-ravaged castle. There's graphic violence, graphic sex, and this twisted love triangle between Martin, Agnes, and her betrothed nobleman Stephen. It's uncomfortable and intense, and absolutely committed to showing medieval life as genuinely horrific. Lucio Fulci made a bunch of gory Italian cult films, and he thought Conquest was going to be his breakout, the thing that would get him into mainstream fantasy filmmaking and elevate his entire career. Instead, absolutely everything went wrong. First, Fulci parted ways with Dardano Sacchetti, his longtime writing partner. They'd worked together for years on multiple films. Sacchetti felt completely betrayed that Fulci was doing this project without him. He sued, and their collaboration ended permanently. Just done. Then the budget turned out to be way smaller than Fulci expected. He thought he was getting real money to make a proper fantasy epic. Instead, they had to cut corners everywhere. Cheap props, reused costumes, the whole production was a nightmare. The movie is set in this mystical prehistoric world. There's a young archer who teams up with a seasoned warrior to defeat an evil sorceress. The sorceress appears completely nude except for a metal skull mask. The whole thing plays out like a collection of violent fantasy fever dreams, one after another. Within the first few minutes, werewolf creatures tear a woman in half on screen. The hero gets beheaded halfway through the movie. It's relentlessly grotesque, more like a gory, dark fantasy trip than any kind of heroic adventure. Fulci thought this would be his ticket to bigger productions. Instead, it became just another weird cult film in his filmography. Sorceress has a completely insane plot. An evil sorcerer's twin daughters are prophesied to overthrow him, so he orders them killed as babies. They get saved and raised as boys without knowing they're actually girls. They grow up to be warrior women. Then one gets captured for a virgin sacrifice and the other has to rescue her. There's also zombies and a laser-shooting flying lion god. It makes no sense. Roger Corman cast identical twin Playboy playmates as the leads. They couldn't act at all. The effects were laughable. The whole thing plays like a parody, even though it wasn't meant to be one. What makes this interesting is the director, Jack Hill, the guy who made Coffee and Switchblade Sisters. He was a respected exploitation filmmaker with a real reputation. This was his final feature film. Hill delivered his cut to Corman, and Corman decided it needed more spice. He ordered additional nude scenes shot and had editors trim the runtime down to 83 minutes. When Hill saw the final version that went to theaters, he was so upset he completely disowned it, refused to talk about it in interviews, didn't want his name associated with it. That's how Jack Hill's career ended, with Roger Corman butchering his final movie. These movies had wooden swords, doorknob props, and actors who'd never acted before. But they also had directors rewriting scripts in hotel rooms every night, twins hijacking productions from famous Italian directors, and Roger Corman consistently demanding more nudity in every single rough cut. The 80s were the absolute peak of cheap fantasy filmmaking chaos. Studios would give you basically no money, send you to Argentina, and expect you to come back with something they could put in theaters. And somehow these things made it to screens, played on cable TV for years, and became cult classics. Most of them are terrible. Some are so bad they're actually entertaining. But the stories behind them, those are always better than what ended up on screen. That's the real magic of 80s R-rated fantasy. Not what you see in the movies, but the absolute insanity of how they got made in the first place. If you want to see more deep dives into cult films and behind-the-scenes chaos, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Would you actually sit through any of these? Or should they have stayed buried in the 80s?